The Romans wrote many accounts of their battles, but the voices of the Gauls survive only in fragments, echoes of a people who stood their ground against one of history's greatest empires. Hello and welcome. Tonight, we will step into that distant world and uncover how the Gauls fought against the Romans, the weapons they carried, the formations they used, and the spirit that bound their tribes together. It is a story of courage, tradition, and resilience, told not in a rush of battle, but in the steady rhythm of history. Before we begin, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more calming journeys into the past. Long before Roman legions marched northward, the lands of Gaul stretched wide and varied. Dense forests, winding rivers, fertile valleys, and rugged hills formed a patchwork that nurtured dozens of tribes. These tribes, though linked by language and shared traditions, lived independently, each with its own leaders, warriors, and sacred places. The Greeks and later the Romans gave them the name Gauls, but to themselves, they were members of clans and confederations. Bound together by kinship and custom, the society of the Gauls was deeply tied to the natural world. Villages were often built along riverbanks or on hilltops, their wooden houses roofed with thatch, their fields spreading outward in patches of grain and pasture. Cattle, sheep, and pigs were tended by herders, while farmers raised barley, wheat, and millet. Life followed the seasons, sowing in spring, harvesting in autumn, storing food for the long winters. It was from this steady rhythm of rural life that their warriors arose. The Gauls were not professional soldiers in the Roman sense. A Roman legionary trained year-round, drilled in formation, and carried state-issued arms. A Gallic warrior was often a farmer or craftsman who answered the call to fight when his tribe summoned him. Courage, strength, and loyalty to one's kin mattered more than uniformity. Men trained themselves with hunting spears, learned the weight of swords passed from father to son, and boasted of their skill in contests of strength during tribal gatherings. When danger threatened, chiefs called assemblies. Messengers went from village to village, summoning men to bear arms. Warriors gathered not in silence, but in noisy, spirited fashion, shields clashing, horns sounding, voices raised in oath. Fighting was not merely duty. It was a statement of honor, an affirmation of identity. For the Gauls, to face the enemy bravely was to show worth before tribe, ancestors, and gods alike. Their weapons reflected this outlook. Long slashing swords of iron, heavy to wield but fearsome in impact, were their pride. Spears of varying lengths gave them reach, while oval shields painted with swirling patterns provided defense. Helmets of bronze or iron were prized possessions, some adorned with horns or animal crests to intimidate foes. Not all could afford such arms. Many fought with little more than a spear and a small shield, but even the simplest warrior carried himself with fierce pride. Clothing on the battlefield was also distinctive. Brightly woven cloaks, patterned trousers, and metal torques worn at the neck set Gallic warriors apart from the uniform ranks of Roman soldiers. To the Romans, this appearance seemed wild, even chaotic, but to the Gauls it was a reflection of individuality and spirit. Accounts from Roman writers often described Gallic warriors stripping to the waist before battle, shouting challenges, and displaying courage openly before combat began. Yet beneath the noise and color lay organization. Tribes formed alliances, elected leaders for campaigns, and arranged warriors into bands under trusted chiefs. Though not drilled like Romans, they fought with energy and flexibility, using knowledge of their land to their advantage. Forest ambushes, sudden raids, and swift charges across fields were familiar tactics. The Gauls relied on momentum, on the shock of numbers and courage, to overwhelm their enemies. Before Rome became their great opponent, the Gauls fought each other as often as they fought outsiders. Rivalries between tribes were fierce, with disputes over land, herds, or honor leading to conflict. Yet these same rivalries also honed their skills. By the time Roman armies advanced into their lands, the Gauls were seasoned in warfare, not by centralized training, but by generations of defending their homes and asserting their independence. This was the world Rome encountered, a land of independent tribes, proud warriors, and traditions deeply woven into daily life. To understand how the Gauls fought against the Romans, one must first see them here before Rome's shadow grew long, when their identity was intact, their courage unquestioned, and their way of war shaped by the land itself. When we think of the Gauls facing Rome, it is easy to picture them as one united people standing shoulder to shoulder against the legions. In truth, the world of Gaul was far more complex. It was a patchwork of tribes, each proud of its own ancestry, each jealous of its independence, and each wary of the ambitions of its neighbors. Yet when the moment came, when danger pressed upon their borders, these tribes could set aside rivalries and summon a shared strength. The call to arms that echoed across Gaul was not the order of a single king or a central government, but a living tradition of assemblies, alliances, and oaths. To understand how the Gauls fought the Romans, one must first see how they gathered themselves, how they forged unity from diversity, and how their warriors prepared for war. The political structure of Gaul rested on the tribe, or civitas. Each tribe was a community of villages, fields, and clans, held together by shared descent and custom. Some were small, numbering only a few thousand souls, while others were large and powerful, capable of summoning tens of thousands of warriors. Within each tribe, leadership varied. Some were ruled by hereditary kings, others by councils of nobles, and some by assemblies of free men who debated decisions openly. Power was not absolute. A chief or king depended on the loyalty of his followers, and loyalty was earned by generosity, courage, and skill in battle. The Gauls placed great value on the act of giving. A leader who wished to be respected rewarded his companions with gifts, fine swords, decorated shields, brightly woven cloaks, or torques of gold and bronze. These objects were more than treasures. They were symbols of honor, binding the recipient to the giver in ties of obligation. A warrior who accepted such gifts was expected to follow his chief into battle, to stand by him in the press of combat, and to uphold his reputation with courage. Thus, the personal bond between leader and follower became the foundation of Gallic war bands. But war was not merely the concern of nobles and their retainers. When danger threatened, tribes called assemblies. Messengers went out across the countryside, summoning men from farms, workshops, and villages. Horns and drums announced the gatherings, and soon fields near sacred groves or hilltop forts were filled with warriors. These assemblies were noisy, energetic affairs. Men shouted their readiness, clashed their weapons against shields, and boasted of their past deeds. Orators addressed the crowds, calling for courage, recounting the insults or dangers posed by the enemy, and reminding all present of the honor of their ancestors. Decisions were not made in silence, but in a chorus of voices, as warriors signaled their approval with shouts and the stamping of feet. When an alliance of several tribes was needed, envoys traveled long distances to carry words between leaders. Negotiations could be tense, for old rivalries ran deep. Yet the threat of Rome forced new bonds. The legions were unlike any enemy the Gauls had faced, disciplined, relentless, and backed by the resources of a vast republic. To confront such a power, tribes that might otherwise have fought one another were compelled to join together. Agreements were sealed with oaths, sometimes sworn over sacred swords or before the presence of druids, whose authority carried weight across tribal lines. Feasts were held to mark the alliances, and gifts were exchanged, solidifying trust among chiefs. The druids, those keepers of sacred knowledge, played a quiet but important role in these moments. They did not lead armies, but they advised leaders, presided over rituals, and reminded warriors of the gods who watched over them. Before a campaign, sacrifices might be offered, animals dedicated at altars, libations poured, prayers spoken to the deities of war, rivers, and sky. These acts gave spiritual weight to the cause, assuring warriors that they fought not only for tribe and kin, but with divine approval. Once the decision for war was made, preparations began. Blacksmiths worked at their forges, hammering swords, spearheads, and fittings for shields. Armorers repaired helmets dented in past conflicts. Leatherworkers fashioned straps, scabbards, and harnesses. Women spun and wove, producing the cloaks and tunics that would clothe their men. Farmers gathered supplies of grain and livestock to feed the warband. Every household contributed in some way, for war was not the concern of warriors alone. It was the effort of the entire tribe. The warriors themselves prepared both physically and mentally. Many practiced with their weapons, sparring with friends or throwing spears at wooden targets. Others performed feats of strength or agility to display their readiness. Boasting was common, for to proclaim one's courage was itself a form of preparation. Men recited their past victories, swore oaths of bravery, and sometimes even challenged one another in contests that tested their endurance. This culture of open pride created a fierce atmosphere, but it also strengthened bonds. As warriors measured themselves against one another before joining together against the common enemy, when the time came to march, the call to arms transformed villages into places of departure. Women and children gathered to watch fathers, brothers, and husbands assemble. Horns sounded, banners lifted, and warriors set out in columns that stretched across the countryside. Some rode horses, the wealthier among them carrying long spears and wearing mail shirts. Most went on foot, carrying shields slung over their shoulders, swords at their sides, and provisions packed for the road. The march itself was an act of display, shields polished, cloaks bright, voices loud with songs and shouts. The Gauls believed in the power of appearance to unnerve the enemy, and their departures were filled with color and noise. Alliances, however, were fragile things. The independence of each tribe was fiercely guarded, and disputes over leadership could easily arise. Sometimes one chief was chosen as overall commander, but his authority was never absolute. He had to persuade as much as command, earning the loyalty of other leaders by his bravery and generosity. The potential for discord was always present, and the Romans, skilled at exploiting divisions, often sought to turn tribe against tribe. Yet when unity held, the Gauls could gather immense numbers, swelling their ranks into armies that astonished even Roman observers. The Romans wrote of these gatherings with a mixture of admiration and contempt. They described vast war bands, tens of thousands strong, assembled in fields with a clamor that seemed to shake the earth. They noted the bright clothes, the strange horns, the fierce faces of painted warriors. To Roman eyes, it was chaotic, undisciplined, lacking the order of the legion. But they also admitted its power, the raw energy of so many men united by pride and passion. For the Gauls themselves, the call to arms was as much ritual as necessity. It was the moment when the tribe became more than scattered farms and families. It became a people standing together. The noise, the oaths, the gifts, the feasts, all reinforced the sense that to fight was to uphold the honor of ancestors and the future of kin. War was not abstract strategy. It was woven into identity as the alliances formed and the warbands gathered. The stage was set for encounters with Rome. The Gauls did not march as a single nation, but as a mosaic of tribes, each with its own leaders, banners, and traditions. Yet when horns sounded and warriors advanced, the divisions blurred, and the collective strength of Gaul surged forward. Thus, before a single spear was thrown at a Roman line, the battle began in fields and assemblies, in the forging of swords, in the swearing of oaths, in the gifts of chiefs. and in the voices of warriors shouting their readiness. The Gauls fought first with their unity, fragile, imperfect, but powerful when achieved. And it was this process, repeated again and again, that prepared them to face the disciplined might of Rome. When the Gauls gathered for war, their strength did not lie only in numbers or in fierce shouts that echoed across fields and valleys. It also lay in the impression they made upon friend and foe alike. To understand how the Gauls fought the Romans, one must picture not only the movement of armies and the cries of warriors, but also the details of iron swords glinting in the pale sun, of shields painted with swirling patterns, of cloaks woven in bright colors, and of neck rings that gleamed with meaning. The Gauls believed that how a warrior looked mattered as much as what he did, for appearance could inspire allies and strike unease into enemies. Their weapons and armor were therefore not only tools of war, but also expressions of identity, wealth, and pride. The sword was the weapon most closely associated with Gallic warriors. Unlike the short stabbing gladius of the Roman legionary, the Gallic sword was long, often measuring close to a meter. Forged of iron, it was designed primarily for slashing rather than thrusting. In the press of battle, a Gaul would raise his weapon high and bring it down with a sweeping stroke, capable of cutting through flesh and bone and even damaging shields. Roman writers often remarked on the fearsome appearance of these weapons, though they also claimed that the blades could bend after repeated blows, forcing warriors to straighten them with their feet. Whether or not this was exaggerated, it reveals how striking the long Gallic sword appeared to the disciplined Romans, who were trained in close, stabbing combat. Alongside the sword, spears were carried by nearly all warriors. Some were light, throwing spears, designed to be hurled before closing with the enemy. Others were heavier, suitable for thrusting in close quarters. The spear was a versatile weapon, cheaper to produce than a sword, and therefore common among those of lesser means. In the hands of skilled fighters, spears could be deadly, allowing warriors to strike from behind the safety of their shields or to launch volleys that disrupted enemy ranks. Shields were central to Gallic warfare. Oval or rectangular in shape, often taller than the men who bore them, these shields were made of wood covered with leather and sometimes bound with metal. They provided defense against Roman javelins and sword strikes, but they also served as canvases for personal and tribal expression. Many were painted in vivid colors, adorned with spirals, knots, or animal designs. To carry such a shield was to carry both protection and identity. In battle, the clash of swords upon shields created a roar that announced the charge of the Gauls and filled the air with the sound of defiance. Helmets were less universal, for iron and bronze required skilled smiths and resources that not every warrior could afford. Yet those who possessed helmets often made them works of art as well as tools of defense. Some were simple conical designs, others adorned with crests, horns, or animal shapes that made the wearer appear larger and more fearsome. Archaeological finds have revealed helmets with detailed carvings, even inlaid with enamel or precious metals, showing that among the nobility, helmets were status symbols as much as practical gear. To see a chieftain riding at the head of his war band, helmet gleaming and decorated, was to see the embodiment of Gallic pride. Armor was rarer still. Chainmail, or larica hamada, was in fact a Celtic invention, later adopted by the Romans. Wealthy Gauls wore shirts of interlinked iron rings, offering protection without restricting movement. Such armor was heavy and expensive, reserved for nobles and their closest retainers. Most warriors fought with little more than their tunics and cloaks, trusting in their speed, courage, and shields to protect them. To Roman eyes, the sight of warriors charging half-clothed or even bare-chested seemed wild, but to the Gauls it was a demonstration of fearlessness. Some accounts describe warriors who fought entirely naked, adorned only with torques around their necks, proving their contempt for danger. Clothing itself carried meaning. Unlike the Romans, who valued uniformity, the Gauls embraced individuality. Their cloaks were woven in bright plaids and checks, dyed with natural colors of red, blue, and green. Trousers, practical for northern climates, set them apart from Mediterranean peoples. Torques, metal neck rings of bronze, silver, or gold, were worn by nobles and warriors of distinction. These ornaments were not mere jewelry. They were symbols of status and bravery. To die wearing one was an honor, and to capture one from an enemy was a mark of triumph. The overall appearance of a Gallic warband, then, was one of energy and variety. Unlike the ordered ranks of Roman legions, where every soldier looked nearly identical, a Gallic army presented a riot of colors, patterns, and forms. Shields of many designs gleamed, cloaks fluttered in the wind, helmets rose in varied shapes, and swords and spears caught the light. To Roman eyes, this seemed chaotic and undisciplined. To the Gauls, it was a celebration of individuality within the collective strength of the tribe. The sound of a Gallic army was as distinctive as its look. War horns, known as carnisses, rose above the warriors, long bronze instruments ending in the shapes of boars or dragons' heads. When blown, they produced a harsh, braying sound that echoed across valleys and struck fear into the hearts of enemies. Combined with the shouting of warriors, the beating of weapons against shields, and the stamping of feet, the noise was overwhelming. Romans described the terror of hearing these sounds approach, a psychological weapon as powerful as any sword. Preparation for battle also involved appearance. Warriors painted their bodies with lime, spiking their hair into tall crests, or decorating their skin with patterns. Such practices, half ritual and half intimidation, made them appear otherworldly, larger than life. Before battle, some warriors boasted loudly, stepping forward to challenge enemies to single combat. These displays were not mere vanity. They were part of a cultural code that valued courage shown openly. To present oneself boldly before danger was to prove one's worth as a man and as a member of the tribe. The Romans often misunderstood these displays. They saw them as undisciplined bravado, the behavior of barbarians lacking order. Yet behind the shouts and colors lay a system of meaning. Every torque, every painted shield, every horn blast reinforced bonds of identity and courage. When warriors marched, they did not see themselves as parts of a machine, as Romans did. They saw themselves as individuals bound together by oaths, families, and honor. Their appearance expressed that identity as vividly as their words. Archaeological discoveries across France, Switzerland, and beyond have confirmed the richness of Gallic martial culture. Swords, helmets, shields, and torques recovered from rivers and graves show a people who invested immense skill and artistry into their arms. These objects were not only tools of war, but offerings to gods and symbols of memory. To cast a sword into a river after victory was to thank the divine powers for success. To bury a warrior with his weapons was to ensure his honor lived on in the next world. When the Romans finally faced the Gauls in open battle, they encountered not only fighters, but a spectacle. The legions, with their silent discipline and identical armor, stood opposite warriors whose every detail proclaimed individuality and pride. It was a clash not only of tactics, but of appearances, two very different visions of what it meant to fight. For the Gauls, to look fierce was part of being fierce, and to present oneself with splendor was itself an act of defiance. Thus, the weapons, armor, and appearance of the Gauls tell us much about how they fought Rome. They remind us that war is never only about numbers and strategy. It is also about identity, about how people see themselves and how they wish to be seen. For the Gauls, every sword stroke, every shield design, every shining torque carried meaning. To fight Rome was to fight not only with iron, but with pride, and that pride was visible in every detail of their martial display. The Gauls were not strangers to battle long before they ever faced the disciplined ranks of Rome. Their way of fighting grew out of their land, their society, and their traditions. Each tribe had its own methods, yet across Gaul certain patterns could be seen, shaped by forests, rivers, and hills that favored sudden charges, ambushes, and shows of overwhelming strength. When the Romans first marched into their territories, these methods met with the Roman style of order, discipline, and strategy. The result was a series of encounters that revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of Gallic warfare and set the stage for the long conflict between Celtic freedom and Roman power for the Gauls. War began with movement. Unlike the Romans, who trained in rigid formations, the Gauls preferred speed and shock. They advanced in large bands, sometimes numbering in the thousands, sometimes much smaller, but always with the determination to close quickly with the enemy. Their favored tactic was the sudden charge, a mass of warriors rushing forward with shields held high and swords or spears ready to strike. The noise of horns, the shouting of warriors, and the pounding of feet created a spectacle that could terrify less experienced opponents. To the Gauls, courage and momentum were everything. If they could break the enemy's will in the first moments, victory would follow. Terrain played a key role in their strategies. The forests of Gaul provided cover for ambushes. Warriors familiar with every path and clearing could lie in wait, springing upon unsuspecting enemies with sudden force. Hills and ridges offered natural strongholds, from which stones and javelins could rain down upon attackers. Rivers, wide and swift, became both barriers and opportunities. The Gauls knew the fords and crossings, and they used them to outmaneuver those less familiar with the land. In their own territories, they were masters of the ground, and they used it with skill. Psychological warfare was another tactic. The Gauls understood that battle was fought in the mind as much as in the body. Their appearance, bright cloaks, painted shields, and fierce expressions, was part of this. Their horns, the carnesses, blared strange and frightening sounds. Individual warriors sometimes stepped out before the lines to shout challenges, boasting of their strength, insulting the enemy, and daring them to fight in single combat. To the Gauls, these displays were not distractions. They were essential parts of proving bravery and testing the courage of their foes. For those unaccustomed, the spectacle could be unsettling, even before swords were crossed. When the Gauls fought one another, these tactics were often decisive. A swift charge, an ambush from the woods, or a show of overwhelming numbers could decide the day. But against the Romans, things proved different. The legions did not break easily. They did not flee at noise or spectacle. They held their shields close, their ranks tight, and they advanced step by step, regardless of what stood before them. For the Gauls, this was both bewildering and infuriating. Where other enemies had crumbled, the Romans stood firm. It was here that the first clashes between the two revealed a deeper contest, between freedom and order, between passion and discipline. One of the earliest and most famous encounters came in the 4th century BCE, when a Gallic force marched south and confronted Rome itself. The Battle of the Allia, fought in 390 BCE according to Roman tradition, showed both the power and the limitations of Gallic methods. The Gauls charged with ferocity, and the Roman forces, unprepared and poorly organized, broke in panic. The victory was so complete that the Gauls marched into Rome and sacked the city. To the Romans, this was a humiliation never forgotten. To the Gauls, it was proof that courage and momentum could bring down even the proudest of foes. Yet Rome learned from defeat. In the centuries that followed, as Roman legions became more disciplined and experienced, they adapted their tactics to meet Gallic charges. Where once panic had set in, now lines held. Where once warriors had broken through, now they met a wall of shields and steady spears. The Gauls still won victories, sometimes surprising their enemies with raids or ambushes. But increasingly, they discovered that Rome was unlike any rival they had faced before. The contrast between the two methods could not have been sharper. Gallic warbands thrived on energy, individuality, and displays of bravery. Roman legions relied on order, silence, and obedience. A Gallic chief might rally his men with fiery speeches and lead them in person at the head of a charge. A Roman centurion enforced discipline with strict commands, ensuring that each man held his place in line. The Gauls fought with the heart. The Romans fought with the system. Still, the Gauls were not without strategy of their own. They knew the value of striking supply lines, of attacking isolated units, of using the land to their advantage. When facing superior numbers, they sometimes withdrew into forests or hills, forcing the enemy to chase them into difficult ground. Cavalry also gave them an edge, for Gallic horsemen were skilled and swift, able to harass Roman columns and strike quickly before retreating. At times, these tactics caused real difficulties for Rome, slowing its advances and forcing it to adapt. The first clashes with Rome were therefore a test for both sides. For the Gauls, they revealed the need for greater unity and coordination. Courage alone could not always overcome discipline. For the Romans, they were a reminder never to underestimate their northern neighbors. Even when defeated, the Gauls left scars that Rome remembered. The sack of the city lingered in Roman memory for centuries, shaping policies, military reforms, and even the fear of northern invasions long after the event. Over time, as contact grew more frequent, both sides learned. The Gauls continued to rely on shock and courage, but some tribes began to adopt elements of Roman organization, training their men more systematically, fortifying positions, and coordinating alliances more carefully. The Romans, meanwhile, refined their methods of facing large, charging masses, developing tactics to absorb the shock and counterattack with precision. Each clash was part of a long dialogue of war, shaping the strategies of both. The essence of Gallic strategy, however, remained rooted in their identity. They fought as free men, not as parts of a machine. They valued courage shown openly, individuality expressed in battle, and the swift momentum of a charge. Even when facing Rome, they held to these traditions, for to abandon them would have been to abandon themselves. This gave them strength, but also left them vulnerable to the order of the legions. Thus, the story of their first clashes with Rome is not simply one of victory or defeat. It is a story of two ways of war meeting each other, of color against uniformity, of noise against silence, of sudden fury against steady advance. In those early battles, the Gauls showed the might of their courage and the limitations of their methods. Rome, humbled at first, grew cautious and then determined. The struggle that began in those encounters would continue for centuries, shaping the fate of both peoples. Among the many features that distinguished the Gauls from the Romans, none was more striking than their reliance on movement. Where the Roman legions were grounded in discipline, their strength lying in the steady wall of shields and the slow, methodical advance of infantry, the Gauls placed immense value on mobility. Their warriors on horseback, and in earlier times their use of war chariots, gave their armies a speed and flexibility that surprised and often unsettled their opponents. To understand how the Gauls fought against Rome, one must picture not only the massed charges of sword and shield, but also the whirling of wheels on the battlefield, the thunder of hooves, and the swift appearance and disappearance of cavalry across open ground. Horses were central to Gallic warfare. The Gauls were skilled riders, their horsemen forming an elite class within many tribes. These men were not ordinary farmers summoned for battle, but often nobles who could afford the expense of breeding, feeding, and equipping a horse. To ride into combat was a sign of status, and Gallic cavalry carried themselves with pride. Armed with spears, sometimes with long swords, and protected by shields, they charged with speed, striking suddenly against enemy flanks or pursuing foes who tried to flee. Their mobility allowed them to scout ahead, harass supply lines, and deliver blows where infantry could not reach. Roman riders often noted the skill and bravery of Gallic horsemen. Though the Romans themselves relied heavily on infantry, they respected the speed of their northern neighbors. Caesar, centuries later in his commentaries on the Gallic War, admitted the effectiveness of Gallic cavalry, especially when combined with allies from other Celtic lands. The horsemen could scatter quickly, regroup, and strike again, a style of fighting that contrasted sharply with the rigid formations of Rome. In open terrain, their speed made them dangerous opponents, yet cavalry was not only for direct combat. In the wide forests and plains of Gaul, mounted warriors served as the eyes and ears of their tribes. They carried messages between chiefs, guided armies along little-known tracks, and raided enemy villages with sudden speed. Their presence gave Gallic warbands a flexibility that allowed them to adapt to shifting circumstances. Against slower-moving foes, this mobility could decide battles before they had even begun, before cavalry came to dominate. However, the Gauls also used chariots. These vehicles, drawn by horses and carrying one or two warriors, had a long history among Celtic peoples. By the time Rome encountered them in full strength, chariots were already fading from use in many parts of Gaul, but their memory lingered. Roman writers described them with fascination, noting how the chariots would race across the field, the warriors leaping down to fight on foot before remounting to withdraw. The clatter of wheels and the sight of armed men darting in and out of battle created confusion and fear. Chariots required open ground, and in the dense forests of Gaul they were of limited use. But on plains or in set battles, they offered speed and spectacle. To enemies unaccustomed to such machines, they seemed formidable. Horses galloped, wheels turned, and warriors shouted from platforms, hurling spears or striking with swords. The noise and motion alone could unnerve an opponent, though not as decisive as cavalry would later prove. Chariots represented the Gauls' instinct for mobility, their belief that speed and sudden action could unsettle even the most disciplined foe when facing the Romans. These mobile forces played both strengths and weaknesses. In the early encounters, Gallic cavalry often outperformed Roman horsemen, who were fewer in number and less experienced. Roman infantry could hold their lines, but cavalry skirmishes on the wings frequently went to the Gauls. Swift charges, feigned retreats, and sudden returns tested the patience of the legions. In pursuit, Roman soldiers sometimes found themselves isolated, cut down by riders who vanished and reappeared at will. Yet mobility also carried risks. Cavalry required coordination with infantry to be most effective, and Gallic warbands sometimes lacked this unity. A bold charge might scatter enemy horsemen, but without support, it could not break the disciplined Roman foot soldiers. Roman commanders learned to use their infantry as anchors, absorbing the shock of cavalry before counterattacking. Over time, Rome also recruited allied cavalry, Numidians from Africa, Iberians from Spain, and even Gallic horsemen themselves, turning the Gauls' strength into their own. Still, the reputation of Gallic cavalry endured. Among the tribes of the north, horsemen were admired not only for their skill, but also for their display. Riders decorated their horses with bronze fittings, painted their shields, and wore cloaks that fluttered in the wind. To ride into battle was as much a show of honor as it was a tactical role. Songs celebrated the deeds of famous horsemen, and their exploits were remembered in stories long after battles ended. The mobility of Gallic forces extended beyond horses and chariots. Their entire style of war emphasized movement. Warbands could march quickly across familiar terrain, carrying only what was necessary. They struck suddenly, raided enemy villages, and withdrew before retaliation could arrive. This form of warfare kept enemies uneasy, for danger could appear at any moment from the forests or hills. It was a way of fighting suited to the land, a land of rivers, valleys, and wooded ridges that offered endless paths for swift warriors. When the Romans advanced into Gaul, they had to adapt to this constant motion. The legions were strong in battle but slow on the march, burdened by supplies, siege engines, and heavy equipment. The Gauls took advantage of this, harassing columns, stealing provisions, and striking at stragglers. Roman commanders grew cautious, setting scouts ahead, building fortified camps each night, and keeping troops in close order even on the march. The Gauls, with their speed, had forced Rome to change. Yet over time, the limits of Gallic mobility became clear. The Romans, with their discipline and organization, learned to endure raids and strikes, waiting for the moment to bring the enemy to a set battle. In such battles, the legion's steadiness often prevailed over the Gauls' speed. Cavalry and chariots could harass, but they could not alone defeat a wall of shields that advanced without breaking. The Romans turned patience into a weapon, allowing the Gauls to exhaust themselves before counterattacking with deadly precision. The memory of Gallic mobility, however, left a lasting impression. Roman accounts often dwelt on the suddenness of Gallic attacks, the fearsome charges of horsemen, and the confusion caused by chariots. Even when Rome had learned to overcome these tactics, the respect remained. In later years, Gallic cavalry was not only feared but also recruited, serving in Roman armies as valuable auxiliaries. What had once been a strength against Rome became, in time, a contribution to Rome's own power. To picture the Gauls in war is to picture motion. Horses galloping across fields, wheels clattering on chariots, warriors darting in and out of combat. It is to see not a static line but a living, moving force, unpredictable and swift. Against the ordered ranks of Rome, this style of fighting revealed both brilliance and fragility. It brought victories in sudden clashes, and it brought defeats when faced with patience and discipline. But above all, it showed the spirit of a people who valued freedom, individuality, and speed, even in the face of the most disciplined army the world had yet seen. Thus, cavalry, chariots, and mobility remind us that the Gauls fought in ways suited to their land and their spirit. They remind us that war is not only about weapons, but also about movement, about how armies flow across the ground. For the Gauls, to fight was to move swiftly, to strike boldly, and to trust in courage carried on hooves and wheels. And though Rome would eventually master and surpass these methods, the image of Gallic horsemen and chariots thundering across the battlefield remains one of the enduring visions of how the Gauls fought against the Romans. When speaking of how the Gauls fought against the Romans, it is natural to picture open fields, charges of warriors, and the thunder of hooves. Yet just as important were the places where the Gauls lived and defended themselves. Their forts and settlements, hilltop strongholds, walled towns, and defended villages were the beating hearts of their societies, and they became the stage upon which many of their struggles with Rome were played out. To understand Gallic warfare, one must not only imagine warriors rushing forward, but also the quiet strength of wooden walls rising above valleys, the deep ditches dug around communities, and the long memories bound into the earthworks that sheltered entire tribes. The Gauls lived across a vast and varied land, from the valleys of the Seine and Loire to the rugged hills of the Massif Central, from the plains of the Rhone to the forests of the Ardennes. In this landscape, they built what archaeologists call oppida, fortified towns or strongholds that served as centers of power. These were often placed on hilltops or ridges, commanding views of the land below. From such heights, tribes could watch for enemies, control trade routes, and show their strength to neighbors. The Romans themselves, who prided their own cities and fortifications, were impressed by the scale and engineering of Gallic forts. A typical hill fort combined natural strength with human effort. Steep slopes and cliffs were chosen for defense, and these were reinforced with massive walls of timber, earth, and stone. The technique most often described is the Murus Gallicus, a wall made of horizontal wooden beams, crisscrossed and fastened with iron nails, filled with rubble and earth, and faced with stone. This produced a barrier both strong and flexible, able to absorb the blows of rams and to resist fire. Atop these walls, defenders could stand with spears, shields, and slings, hurling missiles at attackers. Towers and gateways added further strength, allowing watchmen to see for miles. Inside the oppida lay the life of the tribe. Houses clustered along narrow streets. Workshops rang with the sounds of smiths and potters, and granaries stored the food that sustained the community. Markets were held in open spaces where goods from distant lands, wine from the Mediterranean, amber from the north, metals from the mountains, were traded. Religious sanctuaries stood within, where druids performed rituals and tribal assemblies gathered to make decisions. These were not temporary camps, but living towns, centers of both peace and war. When Rome advanced into Gaul, these settlements became symbols of resistance. Some tribes withdrew into their oppida, trusting in their walls to withstand sieges. Others used them as bases from which to launch attacks, retreating behind their defenses when necessary. The Romans, experienced in siege warfare, found themselves challenged by the scale of Gallic forts. At Avaricum, a great oppidum of the Bituriges, Caesar himself recorded the immense effort required to bring siege engines and build ramps against the walls. The defenders fought fiercely, hurling flaming projectiles and missiles from above, while women and children carried stones and water to aid the warriors. For weeks the Romans struggled before finally breaking through, and when they did, the memory of the slaughter that followed haunted both sides. Not all forts met such tragic ends. Many served as places of negotiation, where tribes considered alliances or submission. The presence of walls gave tribes a measure of security, allowing them to parley with Rome from a position of apparent strength. Others were abandoned when resistance seemed hopeless, the people retreating into forests or mountains to continue the fight elsewhere. The fate of each fort was tied to the choices of its leaders and the shifting fortunes of war. Beyond the large oppida, smaller settlements also bore marks of defense. Villages were sometimes surrounded by ditches and wooden palisades, enough to deter raiders or small bands of enemies. Farmsteads stood alone, but within sight of larger forts to which their inhabitants could flee in times of danger. The landscape itself became part of the defensive system. Forests, rivers, and marshes formed natural barriers, and the Gauls knew how to use them. A community might not withstand a full Roman army, but it could delay, frustrate, or deflect enemies long enough for warriors to gather. The symbolism of these forts was as important as their military use. To live within walls was to live within the protection of ancestors, to share in the strength of the tribe. Children grew up playing in the shadows of ramparts, hearing tales of past victories. Elders remembered the building of walls, the labor of generations. To abandon such places was painful, for they were not only shelters, but also identities set in timber and stone. Archaeological excavations have revealed the richness of these settlements. At sites such as Bibracte, Moshing, and Alesia, foundations of houses, remains of workshops, and traces of ramparts tell the story of vibrant communities. Pottery, tools, weapons, and coins testify to trade and craft. Bones of animals show feasts and sacrifices. Burned layers mark the violence of sieges. Together, these remains remind us that the Gauls were not wandering barbarians, as Roman writers sometimes portrayed, but builders of towns and fortresses as impressive as those of their neighbors. For the Romans, capturing or destroying such forts was essential to victory. They understood that to defeat a tribe, it was not enough to win a battle. One had to take its oppidum. Hence, Roman campaigns often centered on sieges or the patience. And engineering of the legions confronted the walls of the Gauls. Ramps, towers, ditches, and mines were employed, while defenders countered with fire, sorties, and stubborn resistance. These contests were among the fiercest of the Gallic wars, testing both courage and endurance. The Gauls themselves, however, did not see their forts as cages. Unlike later medieval castles, which might bind lords to stone walls, Gallic oppida were as much refuges as fortresses. A tribe could withdraw into the forests, abandon a fort, or build another elsewhere. Their mobility combined with their defenses to create a flexible system. Rome could capture towns, but the spirit of the Gauls was not so easily confined. Still, the fall of a major oppidum could shatter morale. When Alesia was besieged by Caesar in 52 BCE, the walls that once symbolized Gallic strength became traps, as Roman legions surrounded the hill and cut off supplies. Inside, Vercingetorix and his people endured hunger and despair. The double lines of Roman fortifications, built both facing inward against the defenders and outward against relieving forces, showed the grim determination of the legions. When, at last, Alesia fell, it marked not just the defeat of one tribe, but the breaking of a wider resistance. The memory of that siege echoed through history, a symbol of how Gallic courage met Roman persistence. Yet not every story was of defeat. Many forts remained centers of life even after submission to Rome, evolving into Roman towns, their ramparts. Reshaped into new walls, their markets turned into forums. The continuity of settlement reminds us that Gallic identity endured even under new masters. The timber and earth of their walls may have given way to Roman stone, but the memory of defense, of communities bound together within fortifications, remained part of their heritage. Thus, the forts, settlements, and defenses of the Gauls reveal a dimension of their struggle with Rome beyond the battlefield. They were places of daily life, of ritual, of trade, and of refuge. They were symbols of strength and identity, and they were the ground upon which the drama of conquest played out. To picture the Gauls in war is not only to see warriors charging with swords, but also to see the high walls of oppida rising above the land, watch fires burning at night, and entire tribes gathered within, waiting for dawn and whatever it might bring. When one speaks of the Gauls and their battles against Rome, it is tempting to imagine them as a single nation, standing united beneath one banner. Yet the truth was far more complex. Gaul was not a state, but a tapestry of tribes, each with its own customs, chiefs, and loyalties. Leadership among the Gauls was therefore diverse, rooted in personal authority, family prestige, and the bonds of gift-giving and loyalty. It was a leadership that could inspire immense devotion, but it was also fragile, always tested by rivalries and the independence of neighboring clans. To understand how the Gauls fought, one must first understand the men who led them, and above all, the one leader who became a symbol of their greatest resistance, Vercingetorix to in Gallic society. Leadership was less about legal authority than about personal qualities. A chieftain was not a king in the Roman sense, commanding obedience through a hierarchy of officials. Instead, he was a man whose strength in battle, generosity in feasting, and wisdom in counsel won him followers. He distributed gifts, fine swords, ornaments, or captured spoils, and in return received loyalty. His companions, bound by oaths and honor, stood by him in war and celebrated him in peace. A chieftain's power rested on his ability to convince, to inspire, and to reward. Without these, followers could drift to a rival. Assemblies of warriors often decided the course of action, and chieftains had to persuade as well as command. In times of peace, they mediated disputes, ensured the fertility of land and herds through rituals, and maintained alliances through marriages and treaties. In times of war, their role was magnified, for the survival of the tribe depended on their courage and skill. To ride at the head of the war band, shield gleaming and voice ringing, was both an honor and a necessity. A leader who faltered in battle might lose not only victory, but his very position. Across Gaul, many such leaders rose and fell, remembered in fragments of Roman accounts and in the echoes of archaeology. Some were noblemen whose wealth sustained great followings. Others were war chiefs who gained fame through daring raids. All embodied the values of Gallic society: bravery, generosity, loyalty, and the pursuit of honor. Yet the independence of tribes meant that unity was rare. Leaders often turned against each other, competing for power or prestige. It was this weakness, this division, that Rome so often exploited. And yet, in the 1st century BCE, there arose among the Arverni a man who sought to change this pattern. His name was Vercingetorix, meaning great king of warriors. Born into a noble family, he inherited both status and ambition. At first, he faced resistance even within his own tribe, for rivals feared his rise. But through determination, skill, and the support of loyal followers, he seized control. More than that, he set himself to the task that few before him had achieved: uniting the tribes of Gaul against the common enemy. The rise of Vercingetorix came at a time when Rome, under Julius Caesar, was pressing deeper into Gaul. Caesar's campaigns had subdued many tribes through force, alliances, or intimidation. Yet resentment simmered. The presence of legions, the taking of hostages, the demands for tribute, all stirred anger. Vercingetorix recognized this anger and turned it into a cause. He called upon tribes to join together, arguing that only unity could preserve their freedom. His charisma and vision drew followers, and soon his name was known far beyond the Arverni as a leader. Vercingetorix combined traditional Gallic values with a keen understanding of Rome's strengths. He was brave, generous, and inspiring, but he was also strategic. He saw that the Gauls could not always defeat the Romans in open battle, where discipline and formation gave the legions an advantage. Instead, he advocated new tactics: scorched earth to deny Rome supplies, harassment to wear down their marches, and the use of fortified positions to stretch their endurance. This shift showed remarkable insight, adapting Gallic courage to the realities of fighting an organized empire. Vercingetorix's leadership reached its height in 52 BCE, when he united a vast coalition of tribes in rebellion. For the first time in generations, Gaul seemed to move with one purpose. Warriors gathered in immense numbers, their chiefs swearing loyalty to his cause. Under his direction, they burned their own villages and fields to deny food to the Romans, a harsh sacrifice that demonstrated the seriousness of the struggle. He led raids that harried Caesar's forces, cutting supply lines and striking at isolated units. The Romans, unaccustomed to such relentless pressure, found themselves tested as never before. The climax came at the siege of Alesia, where Vercingetorix and his followers took refuge in a great hill fort. Caesar, unwilling to let them escape, encircled the settlement with massive works, ditches, walls, towers, and camps, both facing inward to trap the defenders and outward to repel relieving forces. Inside, the Gauls endured hunger and despair, waiting for allies to break the siege. Outside, vast Gallic armies gathered to relieve them, leading to one of the most dramatic confrontations of antiquity. Yet despite courage and desperate attacks, the Roman discipline and engineering prevailed. The relief forces were defeated, supplies ran out, and Vercingetorix, recognizing the futility of further resistance, surrendered to Caesar. His surrender became legendary. Ancient writers described how he rode forth from the gates of Alesia, clad in his finest armor, and cast his weapons at Caesar's feet, offering himself in sacrifice for his people. Whether or not the details are exact, The image of Vercingetorix kneeling before Caesar captured the imagination of later generations. To the Romans, it symbolized their triumph over a fierce and noble foe. To the Gauls, it embodied both tragedy and pride, the moment when their greatest leader gave all for unity. Though Vercingetorix spent the rest of his life in captivity, eventually executed in Rome after Caesar's triumph, his legacy endured. He became a symbol of resistance, the memory of a leader who had tried to unite the divided tribes and to preserve their freedom against overwhelming odds. In later centuries, his name was remembered as a hero of Gaul, even as his people were absorbed into the Roman world. The story of Vercingetorix also highlights the larger truth of Gallic leadership. It was a system rooted in personal charisma, bravery, and generosity, rather than in institutions or laws. This gave it vibrancy and humanity, but also fragility. Leaders could inspire thousands, but when they fell, unity often dissolved. Rome, with its enduring structures, could outlast even the most brilliant of chieftains. Yet in the figure of Vercingetorix, we see the highest expression of what Gallic leadership could be. A leader who embodied the courage of his people, adapted their traditions to new challenges, and stood against one of the greatest powers of history. Thus, to understand how the Gauls fought against Rome, one must see not only their weapons and tactics, but also their leaders, the chieftains who rallied warriors with gifts and courage, and above all, the man who sought to bind them together into one people. In the story of Vercingetorix lies the essence of Gallic resistance: proud, bold, adaptive, and tragically short-lived, yet never forgotten. To understand how the Gauls fought the Romans, one must first step away from the battlefield and into the rhythms of their everyday existence. The Gallic warrior was not a professional soldier in the sense that a Roman legionary was. He was also a farmer, a herdsman, a craftsman, and a member of a household. His life was shaped by seasons, by work in fields and forests, and by obligations to family and tribe. The way he ate, dressed, worked, and rested all contributed to the kind of fighter he became. Daily life prepared him in body and in spirit long before he raised his shield against Rome. Most Gallic warriors began their days as farmers. The land was central to their identity, and farming provided both sustenance and stability. In the spring, men plowed fields with simple wooden plows drawn by oxen, sowing barley, wheat, or millet. During summer and autumn, they tended crops and harvested grain, filling granaries with the food that would sustain families and feed warriors in times of war. Work in the fields built strength, arms hardened by swinging scythes, backs trained by carrying loads, endurance developed by long hours under sun and rain. These labors created bodies ready for the demands of battle, though the men themselves saw it simply as life's necessity. Alongside farming came herding. Cattle, sheep, pigs, and horses formed wealth and livelihood. Young men learned to guide herds, to protect them from wolves, and to drive them to pasture. Horses, in particular, were prized not only as beasts of burden, but as companions in war. A boy who grew up caring for horses gained the skill to ride them, to understand their needs, and to command them in the heat of combat. Tending animals also created habits of vigilance, for a herdsman had to watch constantly, just as a warrior had to remain alert on a battlefield. Crafts also shaped daily life. Many warriors worked as blacksmiths, woodworkers, or leatherworkers when not in the fields. The forge was a place of heat and hammering, where iron was shaped into tools, nails, and weapons. A man who made his own sword or repaired his own spear carried into battle not just a weapon, but a creation of his own hands. Woodworkers built carts, shields, and house frames, skills that transferred to siege engines or fortifications when war demanded them. Leatherworkers produced belts, scabbards, and harnesses, all essential to equipping warriors. Thus, The ordinary skills of daily life became part of the fabric of war. Family life anchored the warrior. He was a son, a husband, a father, and a brother. Obligations to kin were central. Marriage bound families together, and children ensured the future of the tribe. Women managed households, tended crops in the absence of men, and prepared meals. They also produced the textiles that clothed warriors: tunics, trousers, and cloaks woven in colorful patterns. These garments were not merely practical. They carried meaning, showing identity and pride. A warrior entering battle in a cloak woven by his wife or sister carried with him a reminder of home, a symbol of what he fought to protect. Meals were simple but sustaining. Grains formed the staple diet: porridge made from barley or wheat, bread baked on hearthstones, soups thickened with millet. Meat was less common but treasured, especially during feasts. Pork, beef, and mutton provided protein when available. Dairy products, milk, cheese, and butter were daily staples in many regions. Vegetables, berries, and wild herbs added variety. Warriors ate not only for strength, but also for fellowship, sharing meals with family and neighbors. Feasts, especially, carried deep significance. When chiefs distributed roasted meat or shared large cauldrons of stew, it was an affirmation of generosity and unity. To eat together was to belong, and to belong was to fight together. Training for war was woven into ordinary life rather than set apart from it. Young men learned to throw spears by hunting in forests, to wield swords through games and contests, to defend themselves by wrestling with friends. Competitions at gatherings tested skill and courage. Foot races, mock duels, and displays of strength. Success brought pride and reputation, while failures spurred improvement. The entire community watched these events, reinforcing the expectation that every man must be ready to fight when called. Training was not a separate profession but a lifelong habit, rooted in daily activities and seasonal festivals. Appearance also reflected daily life. Warriors wore their hair long, often treated with lime to stiffen it into tall crests. Beards were common, though some preferred clean-shaven faces. Clothing, woven from wool, was dyed with natural colors, producing cloaks of red, blue, or green. Trousers, rare in Mediterranean cultures, were practical in colder climates and marked the Gauls as distinct. Torques of bronze or gold adorned the necks of nobles and warriors of honor, visible symbols of courage and status. These ornaments were worn not only in battle but in daily life, reminders that identity as a warrior was never far from the surface. Religion and ritual also shaped the daily existence of warriors. Sacred groves and rivers were places where offerings were made, animals sacrificed, weapons dedicated, prayers spoken. Warriors believed that the gods observed their lives, and that courage and honor in battle were acts of devotion as much as duty. Before setting out on campaigns, rituals were performed, but even in ordinary days, the presence of the divine was felt in festivals, in seasonal changes, and in the natural world. To live daily life as a Gaul was to live in awareness of unseen forces, and to carry that awareness into battle gave strength and confidence. The social fabric of the tribe further prepared warriors for conflict. Loyalty to chiefs, respect for druids, and devotion to kin shaped every decision. Honor was not an abstract idea, but a daily currency, measured in how one treated neighbors, how one responded to insults, and how one fulfilled obligations. To show cowardice in small matters risked shame in larger ones. To stand firm in disputes or to aid a neighbor in need was part of the same spirit that demanded bravery in battle. Thus, the daily interactions of Gallic life built the moral foundation of the warrior. Leisure was not absent from this picture. Music, storytelling, and games filled evenings. Bards sang of past heroes, keeping alive the memory of ancestors and teaching lessons of courage. Tales told around fires entertained but also instructed, reminding listeners that bravery and loyalty were virtues that must be upheld. Games of chance and skill added excitement, but they too reflected the competitive spirit that underpinned warrior culture. Even leisure reinforced the values that prepared men for war in times of peace. Then, the Gallic warrior was not idle. He was a farmer at dawn, a herdsman by noon, a craftsman in the afternoon, and a father or brother in the evening. He worked, ate, trained, prayed, and rested within a community that expected him to defend it when the time came. When war arose, he stepped from daily life into battle, carrying with him the strength of his labors, the pride of his family, the skills of his crafts, and the values of his tribe. This integration of daily life and warrior life created both strengths and weaknesses. On the one hand, it meant that every able man could be summoned quickly, ready with weapons and courage. On the other hand, it meant that there was no permanent professional army, no continuous drilling as in Rome. The Gauls relied on natural strength and cultural values, not on relentless training. This gave them vitality and passion, but sometimes left them unprepared for the discipline of the legions. Yet for the Gauls, the measure of a warrior was not only in battlefield skill, but in the honor of how he lived his life. Thus, the daily life of the warrior was inseparable from his role in war. Farming, herding, crafting, feasting, training, worshiping, all these prepared him for the moment when he would take up shield and sword. His courage was not born in a single instant, but nurtured in years of labor, loyalty, and tradition. When he stood before Rome, he stood not only as an individual, but as the living expression of his people's way of life. In his appearance, his strength, his spirit, and his honor, the daily life of the warrior was revealed in every clash of arms. When armies clashed between Gaul and Rome, the outcome was recorded in blood and smoke. Yet not all confrontations were settled by the sword. Much of the struggle between the tribes of Gaul and the legions of Rome unfolded in quieter spaces, in meetings between envoys, in exchanges of hostages, in the giving of gifts, and in the delicate weaving of alliances. Diplomacy was as much a weapon as spear or sword, though its battles were fought with words, gestures, and trust that was fragile at best. The story of Gaul's resistance to Rome is therefore not only one of war, but also of negotiation, persuasion, and the shifting balance of power that came with each encounter. The Romans, long before they conquered Gaul, had already perfected the art of using diplomacy to prepare the ground for their armies. They understood that divided enemies could be managed more easily than united ones. To this end, Roman commanders often sent envoys to tribes, offering friendship to some, demanding submission from others, and threatening punishment for defiance. Gold and silver, promises of protection, and the lure of trade were placed alongside veiled threats of war. For many Gallic chiefs, the choice was stark: to stand against Rome and risk destruction, or to reach terms and preserve their people at the cost of independence. The Gauls, however, were not passive in this process. They too understood the power of diplomacy. Envoys were central to their culture, carrying not only messages, but also symbols of trust, branches, tokens, or sacred objects. Meetings between tribes were accompanied by feasts, exchanges of gifts, and oaths sworn before druids. When dealing with Rome, Gallic envoys brought with them the weight of these traditions. They argued for peace, demanded respect, or sought to stall for time. Some tribes tried to play Rome and their neighbors against one another, shifting loyalties when it seemed advantageous. Hostages were a common feature of such negotiations. For the Romans, demanding hostages was a way to ensure compliance. Sons of chieftains, brothers of nobles, or other prominent figures were taken into Roman custody, treated with a mixture of care and surveillance. To hold a chief's son was to hold his loyalty, for no man wished to see his family harmed. For the Gauls, sending hostages was both a sacrifice and a signal. It showed willingness to engage. but it also revealed the deep pressure they were under. Some hostages later became Romanistes, learning Latin and Roman customs, a quiet form of influence that further tilted the balance. Gifts, too, played a role. The Gauls valued generosity as a measure of leadership, and the Romans learned to exploit this. Coins, fine goods, and exotic items were offered in exchange for cooperation. Likewise, Gallic chiefs offered gifts to Roman commanders, hoping to win favor or to buy time. Such exchanges were never merely about objects. They were about honor, obligation, and the silent weight of expectation. A gift accepted created a bond, one that could later be called upon in war or peace. Not all diplomacy ended in accord. Insults, perceived slights, or broken promises could quickly lead to violence. The Romans, accustomed to their own customs of negotiation, sometimes misread Gallic traditions. What they saw as stubbornness might have been a deep commitment to honor. What they saw as submission might have been a temporary concession. For their part, the Gauls sometimes underestimated Roman resolve, mistaking patience for weakness. Such misunderstandings, compounded by mutual suspicion, often erupted into battles that neither side had originally intended. The shifting balance of power in Gaul was reflected in these encounters. Some tribes sought Roman friendship, hoping to gain advantage over rivals. Others resisted fiercely, rallying neighbors to their cause. A tribe that allied with Rome one year might rebel the next, if promises were broken or pride wounded. The Romans, with their methodical persistence, turned these fluctuations to their benefit, offering peace to some while striking hard at others. Slowly, the web of alliances and hostilities reshaped the political landscape of Gaul, preparing the way for conquest. The role of Druids in diplomacy should not be overlooked. As respected figures who transcended tribal divisions, Druids often acted as mediators. Their presence lent sacred weight to agreements, and oaths sworn before them carried the threat of divine punishment if broken. Even Romans, though skeptical of foreign gods, recognized the authority Druids held among the Gauls. Yet Rome also saw them as obstacles, symbols of independence and unity, and in time worked to suppress their influence. In the earlier encounters, however, Druids stood as witnesses to fragile accords, hoping to preserve peace where war threatened. One of the most striking examples of diplomacy shaping the struggle came during Caesar's campaigns. Again and again, tribes approached him with offers of submission, only to rise in rebellion when opportunity seemed favorable. Caesar himself wrote of envoys arriving in his camp, speaking eloquently of friendship, and then departing to raise warriors in secret. For Caesar, this confirmed his view of Gallic duplicity. For the Gauls, it was a natural response to overwhelming pressure, a way to balance survival and independence. The constant shifting of alliances reflected the harsh reality that no tribe could stand alone. And yet unity remained elusive. The Romans, with their patience and organization, gradually turned these patterns to their advantage. By rewarding loyal tribes with privileges, trade, or autonomy, they created divisions among the Gauls. Those who resisted were punished with destruction, their forts burned, and fields laid waste. Those who cooperated were strengthened, becoming dependent on Roman favor. Over time, the balance shifted steadily toward Rome, not only through battle, but through the steady erosion of Gallic independence by means of treaties, hostages, and gifts. Yet it would be a mistake to see Gallic diplomacy as mere weakness. It was, in its own way, a continuation of their traditions. Tribes had long dealt with one another through councils, oaths, and alliances. They extended these practices to Rome, adapting as best they could to a foreign power whose demands were unlike those of any neighbor. The tragedy was that their system of shifting alliances, so effective in a world of tribes, faltered against the relentless structure of the Roman Republic in the end. Diplomacy between Gaul and Rome was not simply about words. It was about survival. For the Romans, it was a tool of conquest, softening resistance before the legions marched. For the Gauls, it was a means of delaying, dividing, and preserving what freedom could be held. Sometimes it bought peace, sometimes it invited betrayal, but always it reflected the larger truth that the fate of Gaul was being decided not only on battlefields, but also in the quieter moments when envoys met, when oaths were sworn, and when promises were made that would not endure. Thus, the encounters between Gauls and Romans remind us that war is never fought by weapons alone. It is fought also by words, by trust and mistrust, by the fragile weaving of agreements that can unravel with a single broken promise. In the long struggle for Gaul, diplomacy was both shield and snare, offering hope of survival, yet paving the way for conquest. The shifting balance of power that resulted was as decisive as any victory in arms, shaping the destiny of a people whose voices echo still in the memory of their negotiations with Rome. And so we come to the end of our long journey through the world of the Gauls and their struggles with Rome. We have walked with them through forests and valleys, seen their bright shields glint in the sun, heard their horns cry across the fields, and watched as their leaders called them to arms. We have entered their forts and oppida, shared in their daily labors, and glimpsed their courage in both battle and negotiation. The Gauls fought not as one nation, but as many tribes, bound together by honor, tradition, and the call of their chieftains. They met Rome with bravery, sometimes in victory, often in defeat, yet always with a spirit that impressed even their enemies. From the rush of cavalry and the whirl of chariots to the solemn endurance of Alesia, their story is one of courage lived in the face of overwhelming odds. Though the legions of Rome prevailed, the memory of the Gauls did not vanish. Their weapons, their ornaments, and their towns remained in the soil. Their names were written in Roman accounts, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with disdain. And in the figure of Vercingetorix, their spirit was carried forward, a leader who stood for unity and resistance, whose surrender became as legendary as his defiance. You close your eyes now. Let these echoes of the past settle softly in your thoughts. The clash of iron fades into silence. The horns are stilled. The fires in the forts burn low. Across the wide fields of Gaul, night falls, and with it comes a stillness that no empire can erase. Thank you for listening to Boring History for Sleep. If you enjoyed this gentle journey into the past, don't forget to like this video and subscribe, so you can join again for more quiet histories to carry you into rest. Good night.